have Anne Owens, who, after reading your title, you're an associate professor of sociology and management in the Department of Sociology here at USC. So Anne will be talking about housing unit segregation and its impacts on racial and income segregation between neighborhoods and place. So it's yours, 15 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Jorge. Excited to share this work with you today, and thank you to the Lusk Center. I received this award a couple years ago, and I'm happy to say that one paper from this project was published last year in Sociological Science. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So you can check that out for future detail or for additional details. Okay. So residential segregation is often referred to as housing segregation, but often there's actually very little about housing in the segregation literature. It's more about the characteristics of the people, right? So for example, one predominant cause of residential segregation by income is income inequality between households. And so my project aims to bring kind of the complementary story to the table, the story of the housing that people with different traits are actually sorting between. And of course, this underlies, our classical models. But I think the story of housing has kind of gone missing, or it's not at the forefront of a lot of our contemporary empirical work on residential segregation. There's two important exceptions that I'll be building on. The first is studies showing the relationship between subsidized housing and poverty concentration. But as we know, subsidized housing is only about 4% of housing units in the United States. So its reach in explaining kind of macro patterns can be more limited. And then I think most directly related to what I'm going to do today is studies showing that zoning laws that restrict density contribute to residential segregation. But these studies often measure municipality zoning laws kind of either at the municipality level or averaged up to the metro level. And so it kind of misses what's going on between neighborhoods in the same municipality. And so I took a little bit more of a direct approach and just thought, well, let's measure more directly what are the housing opportunities on the ground in each census tract. And these can be shaped by a lot of things, right? Sort of including but not limited to zoning laws. Zoning is kind of necessary but not sufficient to explain these patterns. So overall, I'm arguing that residential processes play out in these stratified housing markets where housing type and cost vary across neighborhoods, and this contributes to residential segregation. So in the paper, I have sort of two sets of empirical tasks. First, I'm documenting trends in housing segregation in the 100 largest metropolitan areas since 1990. And I'm going to look at the segregation or the sorting of housing units by type. So looking at where rental versus owner occupied units are located and where single versus multifamily units are located. And then I look at housing segregation by cost. So looking at rents for rental units and then values for owner occupied units. And then once establishing those patterns, I look at the relationship or the association between housing segregation and residential segregation by income. And I do this at multiple geographies, which I'll talk about shortly. So my data for measuring both housing and income segregation come from the census and the American Community Survey. And these data sets provide tract level counts of housing units in either single or multifamily buildings or rental or owner occupied units. And respondents also report how much they're paying in contract rent and also their home value. And these are reported categorically. So like, if you're living somewhere where you can pay less than $250 in rent, God bless you, and then $250 to $500, $500 to $750, categories like that. So the census and ACS also provide tract level counts of household income, which I use to estimate income segregation. And again, I'm sort of just focusing on large metros today. So I measure segregation with what we call an Evenness Index. And so this is telling us, given the composition, either by income or housing type or housing cost of a metropolitan area, how evenly are housing units or households with different characteristics distributed across smaller areas like tracts. And so for segregation between two categories, I use the renter versus owner occupied segregation. I use the binary information theory index, and then for segregation among ordered categories, the index can be expanded to account for those values of kind of rank order. I won't go into the details of estimating it, but you can conceptually think about this measure as ranging from a theoretical 0 to 1. So 0 means, total integration. Every neighborhood's composition of housing units or income looks exactly like the metro. And then 1 would mean sort of total segregation. There's sort of no heterogeneity within tracts. There's like 100% of one type of household or one type of housing unit in each tract. Okay, so I'm going to consider a couple different levels of geography in this study. So when I say neighborhoods, I mean census tracts, following a lot of urban scholarship. I also look at segregation between places. And so places is kind of a funny census word that basically means like a town, city, or a municipality. And then I'm also going to try to get at the city-suburban divide by looking at sort of the central or major city of each metro and then all other places. And so suburbs is kind of a misnomer because sometimes it's, smaller satellite cities or towns, but that's kind of the best I can do given that the census doesn't define suburbs. So neighborhood segregation can occur within or between places. And to illustrate this, the figure on the right shows 2 metropolitan areas. So these are represented by these dashed lines. Each metro area has 12 neighborhoods of equal population, and those are these boxes. And then each metro also has 2 equally sized places. So think about it as like a city or a town, and those are kind of these rectangles. So pretend that the gray boxes represent neighborhoods that are 100% renter occupied, and the white boxes are 100% owner occupied. So for both metros, neighborhood segregation, sort of segregation between the boxes, is complete. Like there's no neighborhood that has both renter and owner occupied housing units. And so H would equal 1 for both metro areas. But place segregation looks very different. So in this top panel, this whole place over here, this whole town is also 100% renter occupied. And this whole place is 100% owner occupied. So if I estimated segregation between places, that's also 1. And we can say that 100% of neighborhood segregation occurs due to sorting between places. But in the bottom panel, we have kind of this checkerboard situation. So if we pretend these neighborhoods all have kind of equal population, each place is 50-50. So segregation between places is actually 0. They're sort of they have the same composition. And we can say that segregation is entirely within place, kind of between neighborhoods rather than between places. So when I'm talking about kind of segregation between neighborhoods or places, I thought this might be a helpful image to keep in mind. And then H is helpful in that you can decompose kind of total neighborhood segregation and say like what % of it occurs between places, thinking about ranging from a 0% scenario to a 100% scenario. Okay, so let's jump into results. So I'm going to start by sharing just trends in housing and income segregation from 1990 to 2014 between neighborhoods. And we'll bring in the other levels of geography shortly. So I hate putting this much text on a slide. So you can really just kind of focus on this bottom row here, which is showing you the % change since 1990 in housing segregation by type. So either between renter and owner occupied or single and multifamily units. Segregation by cost, either for rental or owned units, and then also segregation by household income. So we can see that segregation by type, there's sort of an increase here in where single and multifamily units are located. They've become sort of less likely to share neighborhoods, to be located in the same tract over time. Housing segregation by cost actually declined a little bit, or sort of a lot in some ways, during this time, both for rents and home values. This indicates that sort of the distribution of rents or home values within neighborhoods has gotten a little bit closer together. We could be seeing recession effects here. We kind of see a decline up through 2007, which could capture kind of the start of the recession, and then maybe an increased sense. So we'll have to see what happens in the future. And then the last column shows trends in income segregation. And consistent with some of my prior work, income segregation among all households between neighborhoods really hasn't changed all that much. It's actually declined slightly. Income segregation has only increased among families with children, which I show in other work. So these scatter plots take the 4 types of housing segregation by type in the top row and by cost in the bottom row. And it's just scatter plots of 1990 on the x-axis and 2014 on the y-axis. And so I think the first takeaway is that, especially for segregation by type, this is pretty tightly clustered. It kind of changed fairly little within each metro over the 24-year period. It's a little less coupled, tightly coupled at the 45-degree line down here. But I think the second takeaway is that the degree of housing segregation between neighborhoods varies quite a bit. So for example, if we look at renter and owner occupied segregation up here, the degree of segregation is 5 times higher in a place like New York or Newark or Dallas than it is in McAllen, Little Rock, Stockton. Those are some of the lower places. And then similarly, segregation by home values is 7 or 8 times higher up in Bridgeport or Philadelphia than it is in Poughkeepsie. So while a capitalist private housing market is a feature of all US metro areas, the degree of housing segregation varies quite a bit, which suggests it could account for different levels and patterns of income segregation in these places. Okay, so to start to bring in different levels of geography into account, if again, too much on this slide, but if you just sort of look at the green squares here and sort of you can pay attention to that change row at the bottom, this table shows the decomposition of segregation into its place and then its sort of city and suburban components in the second and third columns of each panel. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the decomposition of sort of total segregation between neighborhoods, which is what I've been talking about, and sort of present to you, well, what percent of that is occurring between places? If you think back to that kind of 0% to 100% schematic that I showed you at the beginning. So we can see here across sort of all of our measures, about 30 to 45% of housing segregation, either by type or by cost, is occurring between places. So on the one hand, this sort of illustrates that a bulk of sorting of these different units is happening kind of across place lines. And this could be due to zoning policy or other kind of municipality level features that shape what housing gets built there. But on the other hand, the majority, 55 to 70% of housing segregation by type and cost is occurring within places. And so this could be due to neighborhood level zoning changes, but I think our sort of our current best zoning data sets are really kind of municipality level and above, or they focus on sort of one city, which is understandable. It's a big data lift. So I think a lot of the literature examining the relationship between zoning and segregation is kind of missing the stuff happening within places. And segregation of housing within places can occur because of zoning laws, because of historical development patterns, the decisions of public and private actors, all these things that we debate. And then the last column is showing you that a good chunk of about 40% of total income segregation is also occurring between places at kind of this macro scale. So as I mentioned, the other two columns show you patterns between cities and suburbs, but it's probably more interesting to make this point with a map. And the last time I presented this, someone pointed out that red-green is horrible for people that are colorblind, so I apologize. I have not had time to fix that, and it's a good lesson learned for the future for all of us. Don't put red and green on a map. And this map of the Chicago metropolitan area illustrates the macro scale of segregation between single and multifamily homes. So the green dots represent units in multifamily buildings, and the red dots represent units in single family dwellings. And Chicago is among the 10 metropolitan areas with the most segregated single and multifamily housing stock. So if you look at this inset, you can kind of see this blue outline of the city of Chicago. I'm not sure how clearly that's coming through for you, but even within a place, even within the city, there's much more clustering of the green dots along the lakefront, and then there's more red single family homes on the west and the south sides of the city. So within place, there is segregation of housing stock by type. But housing in the Chicago metropolitan area is really highly segregated between places. So fully half of single family and multifamily unit segregation is due to sorting between places, especially city and suburban. And this is evident if you kind of zoom out and look at this bigger map where you see kind of a sea of red and then kind of single family homes and then kind of this island of multifamily homes. So 60% of multifamily units in the whole metro are in the city of Chicago compared to only 19% of single family homes. So if you can't afford or you don't prefer a single family home, it's going to shape where you're going to live. This is Vegas. I'll skip this. It kind of tells an opposite story. And then I'm just going to quickly sort of show, kind of evidence that I think that housing segregation matters. So this is just to estimate the association between housing segregation and income segregation using a longitudinal regression model to predict income segregation in metro area I and year T from housing segregation. I have metro area and year fixed effects and a host of metro area controls. I'm interested in sort of the coefficient on housing segregation, which is sort of telling us if housing segregation in a metro area rises or changes, does income segregation also change? I estimate this at multiple levels of geography that I've talked about, but I know I'm running short on time, so I'll just sort of say these are just coefficient plots for the 4 types of housing segregation. For each predictor, we have 3 sets of models: segregation between neighborhoods, segregation between places, and then kind of the proportion of neighborhood segregation happening between places. Model 1 includes just metro and year fixed effects. Model 2 adds time varying covariates. As you can see, the metro and year fixed effects are eating up a lot of the variation. So the takeaway points are that housing segregation significantly and positively predicts income segregation across all measures of housing segregation and levels of geography. And then I think what I'm bringing to the table here, previous research focuses on income inequality as a strong predictor of income segregation. And in my full models with covariates, I do find that income inequality remains a strong predictor of income segregation between neighborhoods. But the effect of housing segregation is just as large or larger. So it's kind of that complementary piece of the puzzle that I think empirical work has overlooked lately. And then I think importantly, income inequality doesn't predict income segregation between places or kind of the decomposition. And that's because income inequality, doesn't have a spatial component. And I think that's what I'm trying to show, that in order for income inequality to matter, it has to play out against something. If every neighborhood had, equally priced, equally typed housing, income inequality is not really going to matter that much because every neighborhood would be sort of mixed. I'll skip magnitudes. I'll just say that it's substantial. If you compare metros with high and low levels of housing segregation, there's meaningful differences in income segregation. So to wrap up, I think today I've presented several empirical stories. So segregation of housing by type increased since 1990, while segregation by housing cost has not, though it could be since the recession. Looking at the macro scale of segregation, while the majority of segregation occurs within places, places are important, especially kind of city and suburban, for patterning segregation. And then I showed this association between housing segregation and income segregation, net of other key predictors like income inequality, being an important predictor of income segregation at different spatial scales. So I think broadly the story I'm trying to tell is that segregation is kind of the landscape or the backdrop against which all these other things that we know matter play out to contribute to residential segregation. And as long as housing opportunities remain segregated, residential segregation will change little. And I wrote this paper before, I never thought that there'd be national knowledge of, single family zoning and conversation about that in our political and presidential debate. But, I think there is kind of perhaps an opportunity as we think about strategies to deal with the affordable housing crisis to pay attention not only to supply, but kind of where that supply is being built. So I thank the Lusk Center for kind of launching this project. The next step is to kind of expand this and look at racial segregation. And then I also kind of want to step back and take a look at the data that we do have for municipal zoning and examine whether changes in municipal zoning actually change housing segregation on the ground. I think it's probably unnecessary, but perhaps not sufficient condition. So I will end there. Your comments are welcome on the larger project. And here's examples of housing units that I have lived in. So thanks so much.
We have, because of time considerations, time for one question. Yes, Richard.
Just if no one else wants to ask one. So I'm giving somebody else a chance. Okay. Joanne, thanks. Very, very interesting stuff. But one of the issues in measuring segregation is, like, if you have San Francisco appears to be one of the least residentially segregated markets by black-white dissimilarity of any large city in the country. And the main reason for that, or a big reason for that, is it has so few black people that not that many people have to move in order to get everybody in a representative census tract. I'm thinking with owning and renting, you have the same sort of issue, don't you? Some of these places just may not have a lot of rental housing. And so you're just going to get something that looks pretty integrated when in fact it's just that it has a limited housing type. Is this something to worry about, or is it sort of second or third order and not that important?
Yes, I think this is an important point to think about what the segregation measures are telling us. And so the measure that I'm using is sort of conditional on the sort of composition or the distribution in the larger metro. I think that in some ways, looking at the metro and examining this sort of between place component can maybe get at what you're the issue that you're raising, because I think, it's certainly true in many, suburban towns or smaller municipalities. I'm thinking about where I grew up. There's like 3 rental units in the entire zip code or something like that. But I think that's what the between place stuff is showing us. So for example, if you go back to your example about racial segregation in San Francisco, if you kind of zoom out and look at the whole region, you can see, San Francisco maybe looks pretty well integrated by race, but that's because the majority of Black residents have been displaced to Oakland or to other areas, kind of neighboring areas nearby. And so in some ways, that's what the between place stuff is getting us, and sort of taking a look at the whole Chicago metro and sort of indicating, yeah, a lot of these suburbs have almost no rental units, but if you think about it as sort of a larger region, you see that sorting between places. So that's, I think, one way to address it, but I do take your point. I just can't recall off the top of my head kind of correlations between composition and the segregation levels, but it's something for me to go back and look at, especially as I move into looking at the racial residential segregation.
Thank you.